This is the Quran. You may have read it. It's the Islamic holy book. This is a moderate one. I got it in Britain. I was over there about 10 years ago. And I went to the Finsbury Park Mosque, which is in London. And it was the headquarters of a terrorist, a man named Abu Hamza al-Masri, who was the imam there. And he was actually at the same time setting up an Al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. Anybody here from Oregon? Why am I not surprised? And he is now in prison for trying to set up this Al-Qaeda training camp in Oregon. But I went into that mosque. I mean, I was just doing the tourist thing, right? If you've ever been to London, you know, you want to go to the local mosques. And I walked in. I said, I hear you had a little bit of trouble here a few years ago. And the very nice young man there said, yes, we had a bit of trouble here. There were some extremists here, but now we're all moderate. And he really wanted me to convert to Islam. He weighed me down with books, none of them that I'd written. And one of them was this wonderful Quran. Now, what's really wonderful about this Quran is that it's not just the text, but it carries commentary from Sayyid Abu Ala Maududi, who was a Pakistani Muslim scholar, died in 1979. He was the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still the largest, most influential Islamist party in Pakistan. They want a government based on Islamic law there, which they pretty much have already, but they want even more of it. And he is very influential. If you go to your local Islamic bookstore, next time you're there, then ask them if they have any writings by Maududi. And I guarantee you they will say, oh, yes, and hand you a stack as big as this guy was handing me. And so his commentary, in other words, is mainstream. It's not extremist. It's not unusual. It's not obscure. This guy is very famous and influential all around the world, including among Muslims in the United States. And anyway, there's a verse that I wanted to, if you'd open your Qurans to chapter 9. You didn't bring it? I never leave home without mine. Anyway, chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, and do not forbid what he has forbidden, even if they are of the people of the book, that's you, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. The people of the book are Jews and Christians primarily, also Zoroastrians, if any of you are Zoroastrians, and a few others. And the command there is to wage war against them until they pay the jizya, which is a tax, with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Now, I'm not asking you, if you go back to your campus and go to your local Islamophobia professor, that professor, he, she, or it, will tell you that I'm taking the verse out of context and I'm a racist, bigoted, hate-mongering Islamophobe. But that's what the verse says, and let's go to Maududi for the commentary and see how Islamophobic he is. The purpose for which the Muslims are required to fight, required, he said, required to fight, there's no option here, is not, as one might think, to compel the unbelievers into embracing Islam. Well, that's reassuring. But what is it for? Rather, he goes on, its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty. You all are in college. You know what suzerainty is, right? No. The rule, the hegemony, the political overlordship of unbelievers. Its purpose is to put an end to the suzerainty of unbelievers so that the latter are unable to rule over people. That means the purpose for which the Muslims are fighting is to make sure there are no non-Muslim governments or governments not ruled by Islamic law. And that is why the Quran commands them to fight. Now, I started by telling you about Dana Shell Smith and how she was saying that our troops will be endangered because the president said that al-Baghdadi was chased by dogs. If that were true, then it would also be true that they would not fight us unless we disrespected them. that maybe we would open the Quran and find that it says, fight the unbelievers who are mean to you and say that you've been chased by dogs. Doesn't say that. As a matter of fact, it says, kill them wherever you find them. That's chapter 2, verse 191, if you're following along. Chapter 4, verse 89. It's also chapter 9, verse 5. Kill who? Chapter 9, verse 5 says, kill the polytheists wherever you find them. And you might think, oh, well, that lets me off the hook because I'm a monotheist. Well, that's very nice, but the reality is that the Quran thinks you're a polytheist. Chapter 9, verse 30 says that the Jews say Ezra is the Son of God, and the Christians say Christ is the Son of God. There's nary a Jew ever in human history or today who says Ezra is the Son of God, but the Quran says it, so that's it. Jesus is the Son of God. That's basic Christianity. And so in both cases, it says that that is idolatry and that these people are under the curse of Allah for saying this. So yes, the kill the idolaters, the polytheists, wherever you find them, it does apply to you. And you could say, oh, no, I'm an atheist. In the Islamic worldview, held by all the different sects and schools of jurisprudence of Islam, then you are what your culture is. So you might say you're an atheist, but people would say, no, you're a Christian because you're an American, and Americans are Christians. Or you may be a Zionist, which is even worse, because the Jews are the worst enemies of the Muslims. Chapter 5, verse 82 of the Quran. Now, in all these verses that I'm telling you, notice that there is no caveat. There is no distinction made. The first one I quoted to you, 9:29, says, fight those who do not believe in Allah or the last day, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. Paying that tax and feeling yourself subdued is a very major thing. Throughout Islamic history, you will see how this became the basis of an institutionalized system of discrimination and harassment, whereby the purpose, the object of the whole thing was to make non-Muslims feel so miserable and live such miserable lives, such wretched lives, that they would convert to Islam to get away from it. They, in the first place, had to pay the special tax, the jizya, that the non-Muslims didn't have to pay. They had to get off the sidewalk if a Muslim was coming and let them pass, as an acknowledgement of being inferior, like in the old Jim Crow South. The worst features of the old Jim Crow South, in fact, are not taken in terms of people knowing historically, but are strongly related to, in terms of how they were intended to humiliate a people, to the Islamic rules for the subjugated people of the book. They couldn't build new houses of worship or repair old ones, so that the community was in a perpetual state of decline. They couldn't build houses or other buildings higher than the houses of other people, of the Muslims, because the Muslim houses and the Muslim mosques always had to be higher than those of the Christians and Jews, the houses of worship of the Christians and Jews and their homes, to show the superiority of Islam. There are thousands, literally thousands, maybe tens of thousands of mosques in India that are built on the ruins of Hindu temples as a sign of the victory of Islam over Hinduism and its superiority over Hinduism. There is on the Temple Mount, the most sacred site in Judaism, there is not one, but there are two mosques, the Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock, to show the superiority, the victory of Islam over Judaism, its superiority over Judaism, and its victory. The Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Istanbul, was for 1,000 years the grandest church in Christendom. If I ask you, what's the grandest church building, the really most remarkable church building in the entire Christian world, many people would probably say St. Peter's in Rome in the Vatican. But for 1,000 years, it was the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which on May 29th, 1453, was converted into a mosque after the conquest of Constantinople. This was to show the victory of Islam over Christianity and its superiority. Now, all these things happened because the people who were being attacked were Christians and Jews and Hindus. That is the only reason why it happened. The reason why that is the only reason why it happened is because that's the imperative in the Quran and from the example of Muhammad. The Quran also says in chapter 8, verse 39, you can look it up, fight them until religion is all for Allah. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody converts, but fight them until religion is all for Allah means that those who worship Allah have the hegemony over the others. And that's a political thing. As Maududi points out in the passage I read to you, it's a political fight in order to establish a particular political system which is based on Islamic law and is predicated on the idea that non-Muslims have no right to rule anywhere in the world. So, when Dana Shell Smith says this gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi will endanger our personnel in the region, in the first place, she shows she doesn't have a clue. She doesn't have the slightest idea of what the people are that we're facing. That is, what they think, what they want, what they're afraid of, what they hate. All these things you got to know. Why do you have to know them? The oldest adage of war comes from Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Very old book, a couple thousand years old or older, as I recall. And it says, know your enemy. If you do not know your enemy and your enemy knows you, you will lose. And it's very simple. If you don't know your enemy, then you cannot know what your enemy is thinking in terms of what he might do next or why he might do it, and therefore you will not be able to figure out how to counter what the enemy is doing. Now, I've got some bad news for you after all this, after all this sunny and optimistic stuff. Now I get to the bad news. This has been the official policy of the U.S. government since 2011, to officially deny the nature of the enemy. And so it's no wonder that Dana Shell Smith doesn't have a clue. She, after all, is just a minor functionary. But she's representative of an idea that has much greater provenance. Now, what do I mean? I'll tell you what I mean. When I was introduced here earlier, just a few minutes ago, you were told that I had consulted with the FBI and the State Department and various military organizations and so on. And it's true. I used to go into FBI offices fairly often and teach them about the Quran and about Muhammad so that they could know the enemy. I would take them through the basics of the Quran in terms of what Muslims believe, because contrary to what your Islamophobia professor tells you, the reality is that the Islamic terrorists believe they're Muslims. And even our people, as I pointed out to you, know that they're Muslims, even though so many officials deny it, as is clear from giving them Muslim burials and all that. And I would teach them about Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, because these things are very important to the terrorists. If you read ISIS communiques or Al-Qaeda communiques, you will see that from first to last, from beginning to end, without exception, without pause, and without anything else being brought in, they speak about Islam. They speak about the Quran, they speak about Muhammad, and they explain what they are doing again and again and again in terms of Islam and Islam's beliefs and goals and priorities. So if you don't know that, you have no idea what they're all about. So what happened was, I used to teach these things, very basic Islam stuff, to military personnel, to the FBI, to the CIA a couple times. And yes, those guys were more clueless than everybody else. But anyway, the Obama administration in 2011 started to get protests. And in fall of 2011, they actually received a letter that was written by a woman named Farhana Khera of a group called Muslim Advocates, a lawyers group. You remember what Shakespeare said about lawyers, but anyway. No, it's a joke, people. It's a joke. Anyway, if you don't know what Shakespeare said about lawyers, look it up and then remember it's a joke. But anyway, and 57 other organizations that were allied with this lawyers group. They wrote to John Brennan, who was then in the Department of Homeland Security, of course later became the head of the CIA, and is now one of the key figures in the coup to remove the elected president. And they demanded that he remove me by name. I mean, it was kind of flattering in a sense. That he removed me as a trainer. Now, in saying this, mind you, they didn't say, oh, he says all these things that are wrong. They didn't say that at all. They just said, he is saying these things that are Islamophobic. I'll tell you something about that word, Islamophobia. In the 1990s, there's a group, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is tied to the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is dedicated in its own words, according to a captured internal document, to eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within and sabotaging its miserable house. And they invented this word, Islamophobia. You're young now and you've grown up with it, but ask your parents if they ever heard it, ever. No, it wasn't invented yet. And the word was invented in order to conflate, to put together two things that really have nothing to do with one another. One is vigilante attacks on innocent Muslims, which is, of course, never justified, and all those people should be prosecuted, whoever do those things. And second, honest analysis of the nature of the jihad threat. And the idea was to inhibit the honest analysis of the nature of the jihad threat by smearing it as hateful and racist and bigoted. And it worked great. They demanded I be fired. I was fired. Now, the point is not really about me, because every last mention of Islam and jihad in connection to counterterror training was then removed from U.S. government materials. So if you were to join the FBI tomorrow, which I don't recommend, then they will train you, and you say, I want to go into counterterrorism. They'll train you about white supremacists. They will train you about constitutionalists. They will train you about all sorts of people who they think are terror threats. But they will not tell you the slightest word about Islamic jihad. Because the U.S. government has been committed ever since then to denying that Islam has anything to do with terrorism. And so we get these false analyses. And the problem with false analyses is that they lead to bad policy. It's not just talk, but talk leads to action, and the action is wrong. Dana Shell Smith, once again, she said, the gruesome, vivid, and probably exaggerated description of dogs chasing down Baghdadi will endanger our personnel in the region. So what if she were in charge? And there are plenty like her who are still there. If she were in charge, then we wouldn't have sent dogs on Baghdadi. He may be alive today, but we wouldn't have endangered our personnel in the region, right? Because we don't want to provoke the poor dears by making them angry. Dogs are unclean in Islam. Muhammad ordered the killing of dogs, and so to set dogs upon Baghdadi was a particular humiliation. But of course she doesn't know that because she doesn't know the first foggiest thing about Islam, because she knows that to study it would be Islamophobic in connection with terrorism. So if this point of view is carried out to its logical conclusion, then what you end up with is a cowed and scared and intimidated U.S. military kowtowing before Islamic terrorists and afraid to do anything to offend them for fear things will get worse for us. In other words, what she's saying is, when you are confronted with a bully, give in to the bully. Give the bully whatever he wants. Do not, above all, fight the bully. Now, I know nowadays there's bullying classes and stuff. It's a very big deal. When I was a kid, way, way before your parents were born, I was in like 5th grade, and people would say, and I would come home and say, there's a bully, he's bothering me. And so my dad would say, well, did you fight him? No. Well, then you can only expect that he's going to keep going. See, the genius of what we did with Baghdadi was we showed them that we're not afraid of them and that we are going to fight. And, yes. And the dominant view, represented by people like Dana Shell Smith, is that we must not do that we must sit in fear and submit, which is, of course, just exactly what the goal of the Islamic Jihad is, to get us to submit. And so she's playing entirely into their hands. When you're talking about Islamic jihadis, you're talking about people who only understand strength and weakness. They only operate on the basis of intimidation or outright violence. That's all they do. And so if you allow the intimidator to go unchallenged, or give him what he wants, or show him that you're afraid, you know what you're going to get? More intimidation. If you stand up to him and give it back, then the intimidation might stop. I will give you one more example. You remember a few years back, the president moved the embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Now, yes. This was a very big deal. This is actually one of the most important things to have happened in the last 50 years, maybe longer than that. Now, you might find that strange, you know. Why is what happened in Israel important for the United States and the most important thing that's happened in decades? Because the president, for the first time in living memory, was not allowing the United States to be cowed and intimidated. This is very important. In the 1990s, the U.S. Congress passed a bill recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and saying that the U.S. would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in order to recognize that fact. However, the president could postpone this if he thought that the time wasn't right for it. And President Clinton, he immediately postponed it. Now, why did he do that? Because he was told that if he did it, there would be terrorism, that there would be riots, the Palestinians would kill innocent people, and therefore, to keep the lid on the situation, we had to not move it. Now, that makes sense, right? Except what it really is giving in to the bully again. What you're saying is that the terrorists rule U.S. foreign policy. What you're saying is, if you say you're going to kill people because of what we do, then we won't do it, so you win. And so what are they going to do? They're going to kill more people so that we'll do more of what they want. That's how it's worked since 5th grade. You should have known, but they don't talk about this kind of thing anymore. And not only Bill Clinton, it wasn't just Bill. It was George W. Bush. It was George W. Bush. He did it too. And Obama, I can't do Obama. I'd get arrested. But you see what I mean? They postponed it when it came up every year. They wouldn't do it. They were saying, no, the terrorists run foreign policy for the United States of America, and they tell us what we can do and what we can't do, and they told us we can't do this, and so by golly, we can't do it. And Donald Trump was the first one to say no. The United States sets its foreign policy based on the interests of the United States. and we are not going to be threatened. We're not going to be intimidated. You will do what you're going to do, and we will react accordingly as appropriate, but you are not going to dictate to us what we can and cannot do. And people even said, oh, it doesn't really matter because it's so full of red tape. It's such a complicated situation. It's so very difficult. It'll take him 9 years anyway to move the embassy, and he'll be long gone by then. And, of course, the embassy was there within like 6 months. It's really remarkable what the president has done in this regard. But the biggest and most important aspect of it was that he did not cower to intimidation. And there are still many, many people in the foreign policy establishment who say that's what's wrong. That's why he's so dangerous. That's why we have to impeach and remove him. Because he doesn't play by the rules. And he is setting the United States on the pathway to destruction or to conflicts all over the world or whatever. But that notion is predicated on the idea that if we just give in and give the terrorists what they want, then everything will be okay. Or if we behave respectfully toward the terrorists, then maybe they won't hurt us as much. I mean, the other crazy thing about Dana Shell Smith's statement was, it's not like they weren't fighting us already. I wrote a book a few years back. You could find it at Amazon. The Complete Infidel's Guide to ISIS, in which I show that ISIS called for the killing of American civilians back in 2014, and repeatedly after that. It's not as if they're saying, oh, we loved Americans, except now because they killed this guy with dogs, we're really mad. So ultimately, and in conclusion, what we're dealing with is reality versus fantasy. There have been various fantasies and fictions and fallacies that have ruled U.S. foreign policy for decades. They have deformed our response to various problems. The embassy in Jerusalem is just one example of many. And President Trump is doing something different. And that is why they hate him so much. If the president were a Republican like Mitt Romney or John McCain, who was essentially a Democrat, who called himself a Republican. I believe it was Lenin, I'm not sure. Maybe one of you will know, who said, the best opposition is the one you control yourself. And you got to wonder if these guys are just Democrats that were sent into the Republican Party. I'm not saying there was a big conspiracy. You know, they were probably just willing to play along because it's so much easier. You get all the perks, nobody's calling you names, you have all the preferments, everything's great. And so I can see why they would want to do it. But the president represents something that we haven't had in America for a long time, and that's a real opposition to the dominant establishment. So in conclusion, I commend you all for being here. And if you want to know more about the move to Jerusalem and other aspects of that, there's a book, The Palestinian Delusion, that will be out. It's not actually out yet. But this is a hologram. But it'll be out December 3rd and is also available at any self-respecting bookstore. And above all, don't let yourselves be intimidated. You're going to face incredible pressure on campus. And you doubtless already have, or you wouldn't be here. You're going to face abuse of kinds that you didn't even know existed if you stand for the truth. But that's the great weapon you have on your side. That is, what you're saying is true, what you're saying is right. So have some courage, and we will see this thing through. Times are going to be tough for a while, but you are our hope. And your very existence indicates that the United States of America has a great future ahead. Thank you very much.
It does mean that if we are going to understand the enemy in the war on terror, and defeat him, then we must know why he is fighting and what he wants. And to this, the enemy himself constantly takes us back to Islamic sources. For example, in the Quran, it says, fight against those who believe not in Allah nor in the last day, nor hold forbidden what has been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, Muhammad, even if they are of the people of the book. The people of the book are how the Quran refers to Jews and Christians. So that verse is saying that it is part of the responsibility of the Muslim to wage war against Jews and Christians. And this is what the terrorists are picking up on. Now you may say, obviously, however, they are cherry-picking verses and you're taking a verse out of context and using it to establish some point when you can do that out of anything. But the fact is that this is obviously not something I'm doing, but I'm reporting on how the jihad terrorists understand themselves. And this is not, unfortunately, a matter of a few isolated verses that teach something, but it is a much deeper problem. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, said in a well-attested tradition in Islam, in the Hadith, which are the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, which are second only in authority to the Quran in traditional Islam, he said, "Fight in the name of Allah and in the way of Allah. Fight against those who disbelieve in Allah. Make a holy war. When you meet your enemies who are polytheists, invite them to 3 courses of action. If they respond to any one of these, accept it, and withhold yourself from doing them any harm. Invite them," this is the first, "to accept Islam. If they respond to you, stop fighting them. If they refuse to accept Islam, demand from them the jizya." Now, I've quoted to you chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran a minute ago. I stopped in the middle. It says, "Fight even the people of the book until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued." The jizya is a tax, a poll tax that was levied in traditional Islamic law on anybody who was not a Muslim. These taxes were so onerous at various times in Islamic history that people had to sell their children to pay them and resort to desperate measures of this kind. As a result, there were huge numbers of converts to Islam because the only way you could live a decent life in these societies was to be a Muslim. And so they would convert. At various points, the conversion rate became so high that the Islamic authorities actually forbade conversion to Islam because it would destroy the tax base. Now, we were at 2 choices: conversion to Islam or submission as inferiors paying this tax under Islamic rule. The third one that the Prophet Muhammad says is, if they refuse to pay the tax, seek Allah's help and fight them. He also said in another place, "I have been commanded to fight against people until they testify to the fact that there is no God but Allah and believe that I am the messenger from the Lord in all that I have brought." Now get this. He follows that up immediately by saying, "And when they do it, their blood and riches are guaranteed protection on my behalf." In other words, when they convert, then they're safe. If they do not convert, they will not be safe. Their blood and riches will not be guaranteed protection. Now, this is not the hijacking or the twisted version of Islam that comes from a tiny minority of extremists. This is the word of the Prophet himself and the word of the Holy Book. Now, once again, that doesn't mean that every Muslim takes these things seriously. In any religion, and you, as you no doubt well know, if you yourself are religiously observant, there are people who identify themselves in the religion and take it with varying degrees of seriousness. And there are tremendous differences in the levels of fervor that people have. But that doesn't change the fact that these are elements of Islam, so that when anybody starts to take the religion seriously, then they come back to these things. And these are the elements that end up again and again in the explanations by the terrorists themselves of what they are doing. And that is why they're all the more important. The idea that non-Muslims must be offered by Muslims either conversion or submission or warfare is not only found in the ancient texts. I have in my office a legal manual from the Shafi'i school of Sunni jurisprudence. The Sunni Muslims are 85% of Muslims worldwide, and virtually all Sunni Muslims belong to one of 4 schools or legal traditions. Islam is a very legal religion, and there are 4 major schools of law in Sunni Islam: the Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanbali, and Hanafi. The Shafi'i school is centered in Egypt and is headquartered at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, which is one of the oldest institutes of higher learning in the world, and also is probably the most respected authority in Sunni Islam. The New York Times recently called it a beacon of moderation, trying to call Muslims back to the moderate ideals of their religion and to convince them that warfare in the name of Islam was not justified by Islamic texts. That's what the New York Times will tell you about Al-Azhar. But Al-Azhar endorsed as a reliable manual of Sunni orthodoxy this Shafi'i legal manual that was published in 1994. 1994 is not ancient history. 1994 is not really all that long ago. And it says that it is the responsibility of the Islamic community, and I quote, to make war upon Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians until they become Muslim or pay the non-Muslim poll tax. It adds as a comment by a Jordanian jurist that the invitation to Islam must come first before the fighting. Now, that's very interesting because if you read Osama bin Laden's communiques to the West, he's written 3 major ones, one in 1996 and one in 1998, and then one on November 24th, 2002. And in all of them, the first thing he does is call the American people to accept Islam. This is the first thing that he has to do according to the traditional categories of Islamic theology before he fights us. Then if we don't accept, then he fights. Now, if you go to an Islamic bookstore or go online to islamicbookstore.com or islamicity.com or any of the others, then you will find there, very easy to obtain, prominently displayed, works by 2 men, one Sayyid Qutb and another Sayyid Abdullah al-Maududi. Now, Qutb was an Egyptian who was a foremost theorist of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the first modern terrorist group. The Muslim Brotherhood, rather, was the forefather of Al-Qaeda and Hamas, the group in Israel that blows up people on buses and in restaurants and then celebrates the victory, so-called. Qutb was a very, very indefatigable scholar of Islam. He wrote a 30-volume commentary on the Quran, which is quite a feat in itself when you consider that the Quran is a very short book, actually. It's shorter than the New Testament. And so to write a 30-volume commentary is going some way. He wrote, extrapolating from the ideas that I have outlined here already, he wrote that it is not the function of Islam to compromise with the concepts of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah is the society of unbelievers. Any state that is ruled by a non-Islamic legal system, Qutb would have considered to be in a state of Jahiliyyah. It's the pre-Islamic period of ignorance. The periods before various Islamic states converted to Islam are also known as Jahiliyyah, the period of ignorance. And he says it is not the function of Islam to compromise with the concepts of Jahiliyyah, which are current in the world, or to coexist in the same land together with a Jahili system. Islam cannot accept any mixing with Jahiliyyah. Either Islam will remain or Jahiliyyah. No half-half solution is possible. The foremost duty of Islam, this is Qutb, is to depose Jahiliyyah from the leadership of man. In other words, any state that is constituted by any system, the U.S. Constitution, the British parliamentarian system, any state that is so constituted that is not obeying Islamic law must be fought. Maududi, the same thing. Non-Muslims, he said, have absolutely no right to seize the reins of power in any part of God's earth, nor to direct the collective affairs of human beings according to their own misconceived doctrines. If they do, the believers would be under an obligation to do their utmost to dislodge them from political power and make them live in subservience to the Islamic way of life. Now, these books are readily available, and they're readily available because they are not tiny minority of extremists who have hijacked the religion. They are mainstream ideas within the Islamic community. They are backed up by 14 centuries of Islamic history that is marked by jihad warfare, and they are backed up by the theology that is elaborated in the Quran, in the Hadith, and in Islamic law. When the terrorists act today, they are acting according to these principles. They are waging war in order to unite the Islamic world under a caliph. The caliph was the successor of Muhammad as the leader of the Islamic community. Because of Muhammad's nature as a warrior prophet, the caliph also was both a religious and a political and military leader. And the caliphate was abolished by the secular Turks in 1924 in an attempt to destroy political Islam and to establish Islam after the fashion of Christianity and Judaism in the West as religions that would be easily compatible with a system that separated religion from the state. It didn't work. As a direct reaction to the abolition of the caliphate, the Muslim Brotherhood, the first modern terrorist organization, was founded in 1928 in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna. And Hamas and al-Qaeda come from that. It was a direct reaction to the abolition of the caliphate was this reassertion of political Islam through these violent terrorist groups. What Osama wants to do, what all the others want to do, all the people who are committing violence in the name of Islam, from Indonesia to the Philippines to Thailand to Kashmir to Nigeria to Chechnya to Bosnia, all over the world, there is in common, they uniformly say, they want to reestablish the caliphate, to restore Islamic law, which is not fully enforced in the Islamic world today except in Saudi Arabia and Iran, reassert Islamic law, and reestablish Sharia, which is Islamic law, over those states, and then to wage offensive jihad against the West, because it is one of the duties of the caliph to at least every 10 years stage a campaign against the non-Muslim states. They will constantly refer to 1924, the date of the abolition of the caliphate, as the beginning of all their troubles, because it was considered to be the loss of the ability to wage offensive jihad and the loss of the unity of the Islamic world. This is what they say they are fighting for. This is why they took down the towers on 9/11, why there were the London bombings, why there were the bombings in Spain on March 11th, 2004, why there have been 2,647 people killed in the world in the name of Islam since 9/11. Now, if that's what they say, then we have a duty to pay that attention and to take it with the utmost seriousness and not rush to say, no, Islam has nothing to do with this. Because if that's what they say, then the foremost duty of moderate Muslims is not to reassure us, not to reassure non-Muslim Westerners that Islam is a religion of peace, but to convince those guys that they're misusing Islam, if they can do so. But as of yet, there is no American Muslim advocacy group and there is no group of Muslims in the world anywhere that is making any organized effort to convince the jihad terrorists that their version of Islam is wrong. Not anywhere. There are groups in the United States and elsewhere that are taking great pains to convince non-Muslims that Islam is really peaceful and that all this is not really legitimately Islam. But the problem with saying nothing about that and letting it pass by unquestioned is that it leaves us open to being blindsided from attacks from quarters from which we are not willing to admit to ourselves that attacks may come.
I'm from California, and a lot of times that's the hottest topic actually in every university. And many professors mentioned that, well, Christians came to Americas and destroyed all the natives and killed, and there was a genocide, and also they often mention Catholic Inquisition. And they say that, well, Christians were terrorists too. So in history, some or other religion has that problem, and it doesn't mean we have to go after Muslims this time. So what would you say to that?
Many things. One of the things is no culture is perfect, and no history is spotless. And don't get maneuvered into the position of having to defend everything that's ever happened in the Western world. That's just a red herring. Because as we all know, two wrongs don't make a right. And the fact that one person has done something wrong doesn't mean it's okay for somebody else to do something wrong. The fact is that there is no global organization, and never has been for that matter, of Christian or Jewish terrorists who are pressing forward with explicit reference to Christian or Jewish scriptures to establish a Christian or Jewish state with the hegemony of religious law. There is not now or ever has been, but there is a global movement of Muslims who are acting in the name of Islam with copious references to Islamic scriptures to establish Islamic states and to subjugate the world under that rule. Now, the fact that Christians may have done something wrong 500 years ago doesn't make it any less true that it is Islamic terrorists who are menacing the world. And so the question is not who is sinless in this. Nobody is. But the question is, what is the obstacle that the world is facing? What is the challenge that the world is facing today? And what the challenge that the world faces today is from Islamic jihad. It doesn't mean at the same time that we must go to war against Islam or declare all Muslims the enemy. As I said before, there's a great spectrum within Islam itself. But we have to challenge Muslims of goodwill to face up, to admit to these elements of their religion, and to admit that the terrorists are working from a broad mainstream tradition within Islam, and challenge them to stand up to that and work to reform it, if they can. And to stop this denial and obfuscation that is almost universal in the American media and from Muslim spokesmen today, where they say, no, 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 this is not in Islam at all. We have to challenge them and at the same time say that we need to maintain a strong defensive posture against this, and that the fact that there was an inquisition or something doesn't mean that we shouldn't defend ourselves against this at all. When Jerry Falwell starts beheading people, then I'll worry about him. Until then, to make some kind of equivalence argument is ridiculous.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kyle. I'm a student at Wingate University. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, I believe it's Nasq or abrogation, and how that plays into Islamic terror.
Absolutely. There's a lot of confusion about this issue because people tell you Islam is a religion of peace, and they even quote the Quran and tell you Islam is a religion of peace. The Quran says, say to the unbelievers, you have your religion, we have ours. That's chapter 109 of the Quran. And so that seems to be sort of, let's just all get along. You have your way of thinking, we have ours, we'll leave each other alone. The problem is, indeed, abrogation, or nasq. Nasq is the idea that, well, it's spelled out in chapter 2, verse 106 of the Quran. When we abrogate, we being Allah, when we abrogate or cause to be forgotten a passage, then we will replace it with one that is just as good or better. Saying, when we cancel something out in the Quran, we'll give you something that's even better. Now, why you would need to cancel anything in what's supposed to be the perfect and eternal book, this is a theological problem within Islam, that the perfect and eternal book seems to contain contradictions. But that for another day. The upshot is this, that Muhammad, in the course of his career, according to Islamic tradition, first started out preaching tolerance when the Muslims were a small group and weak. And then when they gained power, especially after the Hijrah, the move from Mecca to Medina, then they started to wage defensive jihad. When they were attacked, they would fight back. And then finally, offensive jihad. The Quran in chapter 8, verse 39 says, fight until religion is all for Allah. That's a maximalist prescription. Fight until religion is all for Allah means they keep fighting until the whole world is Islamic or subjugated under the rule of the Muslims. So the problem that is, how do you deal with that? When he's teaching tolerance here and maximalist warfare here, the understanding in Islam is that the verses that were revealed later in Muhammad's career cancel out or abrogate those that came earlier. Unfortunately for us, the tolerant passages come first, and then later in his career comes the warfare. So the warfare is considered in Islamic theology to be the stance that Muslims must have that's valid for all time, whereas the tolerance only kicks in when Muslims are a small group and weak. So warfare against unbelievers is the Quran's final word on jihad.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Hello.
Hi, sir. My name is Elisa Segmiller, and you did touch on my question just a little bit right now, but my question is a little bit in another direction. Obviously, as you pointed out, there's a lot of political correctness surrounding this issue, and one argument that I keep getting hit with that I don't know exactly what the comeback should be is I'm usually referred back to Christianity, and they're like, well, in the Bible it says, it says some violent things, and we shouldn't like discriminate against Muslims because it says peaceful things, and they live by the peaceful things the same way the Christians have the violent and the peaceful, and they live by the peaceful. And so how do you combat that argument?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In the first place, I'm not advocating any kind of discrimination. You said we shouldn't discriminate against Muslims. There is no discrimination involved in self-defense, in defending against a manifest threat. That doesn't mean that anybody loses any rights that anyone legitimately has. But you do start to forfeit rights when you are committing subversion, sedition, or open warfare against the United States. And that's what we have. Those bombs in New York were acts of war in a larger war. That guy is an enemy combatant. And so it's not discrimination to try to stop people like that. Anyway, as far as the idea that the Bible contains violent passages, it does. But there are several things about them that make it a markedly different situation. One is that the Bible contains many passages such as in the book of Joshua, God tells Joshua to go and kill everybody in this particular area. And there are other passages like that elsewhere. Now, nowhere does it say, go and imitate Joshua. And nowhere in the history of people who believed in the Bible, Jews and Christians, do you ever find in either group, which is not to say Christians in particular have not been violent, but they've never pointed to the book of Joshua or to any other passage in the Bible and said, because Joshua cleared out this city, we can imitate him and follow his example. Those passages are descriptive. They describe things that happen. And because they say God ordered these killings, they do create a big problem for theologians. But they've never been held up as exemplary. They are descriptive, not prescriptive. That is, they describe, they don't prescribe. They don't tell you what you ought to do. They tell what other people were told to do. In the Quran, it's very different. These are open-ended, universal commands to all believers to wage war against all unbelievers, which doesn't mean that all believers are going to pay attention to them, but they're in there. Now, it's also noteworthy that there have been over 20,000 jihad terror attacks resulting in deaths since 9/11 around the world. There are armed jihad groups acting upon the Quran and the teachings of Islam all over the world. Where do you ever see Christians screaming, Jesus is Lord, and blowing people up? You never hear that. But Muslims screaming Allahu Akbar and killing people, almost a daily occurrence somewhere in the world. There's a reason for that. And it's not just an accident or coincidence, in other words. And it's not only that these passages are descriptive and not prescriptive, but also both Judaism and Christianity look at the passages that are violent in ways that completely mitigate the violence. In other words, it's like this. Judaism, you may know, underwent a radical change when the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70 AD, 70 CE. In that year, with the destruction of the temple, all of those rules, if you've ever read the Old Testament, you've seen a lot of laws and rules about various kinds of ritual behavior. And those are the same places where you find the violence. And Judaism completely rejected the literal understanding of those things. It says the law, those ritual laws, cannot be applied in the absence of the temple. And so there is no justification for behaving in any way that would include those violent passages and the other passages that jar us nowadays. It's all gone. Christianity, in much the same way, says Jesus Christ fulfilled the law, and Christians are not bound by the law. And those passages about violence are all in the law. So it's either way, both of them have developed interpretative traditions that reject the literal understanding of the verses. And the verses don't command people to imitate them anyway. So there's nothing really to the argument.
Thank you, sir.
My name is Doyle Wang. I'm a rising freshman at Hillsdale College from my home state of Georgia. And since you said that there are moderate Muslims that are willing to speak out against jihad, is it still accurate to say that Islam in general today has become a very violent religion?
Yes, Islam actually is a very violent religion right from the beginning. All you have to do is read the Quran and see that Islam is a violent religion. It's the only major world religion that has a developed doctrine and theology and legal system that mandates warfare against unbelievers. But we have to make a distinction that is so often elided, so often not made. And the distinction is between Muslims and Islam. Jesus said, love your enemies and turn the other cheek. There are, however, very many Christians who do not love their enemies and turn the other cheek. Does this mean Jesus didn't say it? No, he still said it. It's Christianity. But many Christians do not live up to that. It's the same thing in Islam. Islam teaches warfare against and subjugation of unbelievers. The Quran says Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. That's chapter 48, verse 29 of the Quran. That's in the Quran. That's the teaching of Allah as far as Muslims are concerned, the supreme God. Whether or not any individual Muslim takes that seriously or puts that into practice, that is a different question altogether. People have a variety of influences. You yourself may be very religious or not very religious, or you may be interested in religion, but you also have other things that you're interested in that conflict in various ways. These things are all part of human development, and every individual is different. So you cannot assume that any Muslim holds to all these things and is an active jihadi. But does that mean that Islam does not teach jihad, warfare against, and subjugation of unbelievers? Unfortunately not. It does teach it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Michael Bezoyan, UCLA. My question is, given the conflict between Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, how do you see this ending? Because if the religion calls for conquest, then unless you put an end to the religion, there's always going to be this ongoing desire for converting the non-believer, either through jizya or just by killing the non-believer.
Just by way of explanation, Dar al-Harb is the house of war. Dar al-Islam is the house of Islam. Islamic theologians from the Middle Ages on to the modern age have divided the world into the house of war and the house of Islam, with the house of Islam having the responsibility to be expanded by the Muslims at the expense of the house of war. We are in the house of war here in the United States. As long as there are people who believe that, then there's going to be conflict between Muslims and non-Muslims. That's unavoidable. Ideas matter. Ideas dictate actions. And people who believe that the supreme God wants them to wage war against and subjugate or kill people who don't believe in that God, they're going to keep coming. What we can do is, therefore, not solve the problem, but we can contain it. The Islamic theology teaches that you don't wage jihad against an enemy you have no chance to defeat. No chance to defeat, meaning more than twice your strength. So what we have to do is be strong. We have to be strong, not just militarily, but societally and culturally, not with these groveling apologies like General Allen gave. He had a chance when the Quran was supposedly desecrated. He had a chance to stand up and say, in America, we believe in freedom of expression. We put up with each other, even if we have fundamental disagreements about important, life-changing principles. Because we understand that to live in a pluralistic society, you have to put up with people who don't believe the same way you do and are willing to be offended without resorting to violence. And that is a principle we are bringing to Afghanistan. And instead, he acted as if he was already a believer in Islam and submitted to the idea that Quran desecration was some heinous crime, when if it had been a Bible, everybody would have shrugged and gone on. And so we have to stand for our own principles. And if we do that, I believe that there are even many Muslims who will want to live in a society that stands for and defends the freedom of speech and the equality of rights of all people before the law. We didn't do that in Iraq and Afghanistan. We enshrined Islamic law as the highest law of the land in both. If we stood for our principles, I think that would be one major thing. If we stood strong and worked to contain the threat, so that in Muslim countries they might be waging jihad, but they can't get over here to do it, then we could secure generations of peace for ourselves and for our children.
Hi, Spencer Chan, Room of the World High School. My question is, so you said that in the Quran it's fundamentally violent, but couldn't someone argue that the Bible is also fundamentally violent? What would your refutation to that be?
In the first place, the whole point being made there is that somehow we shouldn't be concerned about jihad terrorism because the Bible is also violent. And so I'd like to question that first.
that maybe the Bible is the most violent book in the world. Maybe it's just a terrible book seething with hatred and rage. But that actually doesn't tell us a thing about the Quran, because it's a different book. And there have been 28,000 murderous jihad attacks around the world since 9/11. That has to be dealt with. And whatever the Bible says, that has to be dealt with. You see? So in the first place, people who say that to you, they're just trying to confuse you and deflect your attention away from the reality of jihad terror. There's more. Also, when I say that there have been 28,000 murderous jihad attacks around the world since 9/11, how many murderous terror attacks have there been by Jews and Christians who pointed to the Bible to justify their actions since 9/11? 0. Now, why is it 28,000 on the one hand and 0 on the other? Because actually the violence in the Bible is there, but it's very different from the violence in the Quran. In the Quran, I told you, it says, kill them wherever you find them 3 times. Chapter 2, verse 190, chapter 4, verse 89, chapter 9, verse 5. It says, when you meet the unbelievers, strike their necks. Chapter 47, verse 4. When you meet the unbelievers, it says, strike terror into the hearts of the enemies of Allah. Terror. Chapter 8, verse 60, and so on and so on. In the Bible, there are stories of God telling various prophets to go and kill various people. Terrible stories. And they have embarrassed Jews and Christians ever since. And if you get Bible commentaries, you will see that usually they're spiritualized, and they're explanations of them by Jewish and Christian theologians saying, these don't mean that you should go and kill. This is an allegory for spiritual struggle and spiritual growth in a genuine sense. They are never held up as being something you should imitate. They are never direct commands to the believers to go and kill unbelievers. And this is why you've never seen in the history of Christianity or Judaism somebody saying, well, Joshua was told to clear out this city, and so we're going to clear out this city in the same way. They were very specific prescriptions for specific times, which is not to justify them either. And they do create exegetical problems. But there is no sect or school of law in Judaism or Christianity that mandates warfare against unbelievers, whereas all the sects and schools of law take the Quran's commands to violence as being prescriptions, not just descriptions as in the Bible, but prescriptions for action now, and teach that Muslims have to wage war against unbelievers.
It says, I haven't read the Bible much, but it says that you should stone those who commit adultery.
Yeah.
And then some people say that that's Old Testament, it's no longer applicable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Those who stone people to commit adultery, that's happening in Iran, that's happening in Saudi Arabia, that's happening in the Islamic State. In other words, it's happening in places that enforce Islamic law because it's commanded in Islamic law. Israel, the Jewish state, does not stone people for adultery. There is no Christian state in the world today, but there are no Christian groups that are calling for adulterers to be stoned. Why is that? Do they all ignore the Bible? No. The books, the holy books, cannot be separated from the traditions in which they live, in which they arose. And so there are interpretative traditions in Judaism which say essentially this, that the laws about stoning, the laws about everything else, various rituals and so on, they were connected to the temple worship. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And after that, those laws are not applicable, because they cannot be applied as long as there's no temple. In Christianity, there's the idea that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law, and thus the law is no longer applicable, because the Christians are under the grace of Jesus Christ and not the law. And so they don't have to obey those laws. Those laws do not apply nowadays. And so in both cases, Judaism and Christianity have interpretative traditions that reject the idea that the Bible says stone adulterers, therefore stone adulterers. They have instead rejected the literal understanding of those passages. Whereas in the Quran, the literal understanding is dominant and is not superseded by anything in any interpretative tradition of Islam. All the schools of Islamic law teach you have to stone adulterers, as well as all the other things, behead and everything else. Cut off the hands of thieves, because that's in the Quran.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Adriana, and I have a question about radical Islam. I hear a lot about it, and I was wondering, is there a difference between Islam and radical Islam, or is all Islam radical?
all Islam is radical, but not all Muslims are radical Muslims. It's important to make the distinction between Islam and Muslims. I expect some of you here are Christians, and yet you might do things now and again that are not actually in line with Christianity. And it's the same thing with Muslims. It's the same thing with anybody. There are some people who are very knowledgeable and devout, and some people who are not, but they all call themselves by the name of the religion. And so the teachings of the religion are one thing, and how any individual practices it is another. There are millions of Muslims worldwide, and we can be glad of it, who have no interest in waging jihad. They just want to have a job and raise a family and live a life and not be bothered, as millions of people who are not Muslim also feel the same way. But if you ask them, they'll call themselves Muslims. Sure, absolutely. But that is a separate question from what Islam teaches. Islam teaches warfare against unbelievers, the subjugation of unbelievers, the beating of disobedient women, the institutionalized oppression of women and non-Muslims. It teaches all these things. They're all in the Quran and in the example of Muhammad. Islam teaches those things. The fact that many Muslims don't care and live wonderful lives does not change the fact that those teachings are there. And it's unfortunate that those teachings are there, because then the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and other jihad groups can and do point to those teachings to make recruits among peaceful Muslims. So the answer is, there is no Islam that's not radical in the generally understood meaning of the word. In other words, there is no Islam that teaches peaceful coexistence between Muslims and non-Muslims on an indefinite basis, and equality of rights of Muslims and non-Muslims before the law as an ideal. There is no form of Islam that teaches that. But there are plenty of Muslims who live that way.
Some Muslims compare the violence in the Quran to the violence in the Old Testament. They say, look, it's all the same. So if you're going to condemn the violence in the Quran, why you don't condemn the Old Testament with the same measure?
There are several aspects to that. One is that there are no Jewish or Christian exegetes. There are no Jewish or Christian scholars ever who have ever read the book of Joshua and said, you see, the prophet, he cleared out these cities, and so therefore we must do the same thing and fight against our enemies in the same way. In other words, no one has ever, no Jew or Christian has ever taken those passages as meaning that these are instructions for the way he should behave as a believer today.
Right.
The passages in the Old Testament that are violent are descriptive rather than prescriptive. In other words, they describe various things that were done by various prophets, and it's been problematic for Jewish and Christian scholars all through history as to how God could order that kind of thing. Generally, they have understood the passages in a spiritual way as parables in a certain sense for fighting against sin in one's soul. But never have they understood them as instructions, whereas in the Quran, the believers are ordered by God to make war against the unbelievers. And this is a prescription, in other words, not just a description of somebody doing something that is not necessarily to be imitated.
Right.
And so that's one of the most important differences. Also, of course, for Christians, the New Testament comes after the Old. And so I've had so many Muslims say, how can you condemn the practice of stoning when stoning is prescribed in the Old Testament? And I say, well, I can condemn it because in the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, the Lord Jesus condemns it. And essentially, and says that makes it impossible by setting a standard that no one can live up to in order to carry it out.
Okay.
And so we, as Christians, read the Old Testament in light of the New, and that changes our understanding of it to a tremendous degree. But it also must be said that even in the rabbinic tradition in Judaism, these passages have been spiritualized, and there is no tradition anywhere that takes them as literal instructions. And so in the Islamic tradition, unfortunately, there is no such tradition anywhere of the spiritualizing of Quranic passages that exhort to violence, or any blunting of their force, their literal force, to incite the believers to commit violence.
So you see it different. It's not the same kind of violence.
Exactly.
And one some Muslims are trying to defend Islam, saying that, look at these attacks are carried against UK, United States, countries who have wars against Muslim countries. So they brought it upon themselves rather than it's coming from Islam. It's just a reaction to what the United States is doing in the Middle East and other countries and what UK is doing in the Middle East. And how you respond to that?
Well, the problem is, before the U.S. was doing anything in the Middle East, before the UK was doing anything in the Middle East, there was jihad.
Okay.
And there was jihad against the West. There was jihad against Christian Europe.
Right.
The Ottomans were in Vienna in 1683. And that was the high point of their advance into Europe.
Right.
But they weren't reacting to U.S. policy. There was no U.S.
Right.
The reality is that all the jihads today are defensive. It's true. And that's a function of Islamic theology.
Right.
Because in Islamic law, only the caliph can declare offensive jihad.
Right.
And there is no caliph, not since 1924 when the
Right.
Turkish government abolished the office.
Right.
And so there is no one authorized in the Islamic world to declare offensive jihad against non-Muslims.
Okay.
And so the jihadis have an obligation, if they want to portray their jihad as correct Islamically, they have to portray it as defensive. Because defensive jihad, you need no approval for, you need no permission for.
Right.
It becomes the obligation of every individual Muslim as soon as an Islamic land is attacked.
Right.
So the grievance theater that we see in the Islamic world, the complaining about various atrocities of the West, the endless complaint whining about what Israel has done or what the United States has done or what the UK has done, it really has a purpose, and that is to justify the jihads from a theological standpoint within Islam.
Okay.
But it is incorrect to say that if the West were to stop doing these things, then the jihad would cease.
So you see it as excuses used by terrorists to, like, kind of propaganda of their
Yes.
jihad strategy
Oh, yes.
among Muslims?
Yes, quite so. And the pretexts always shift, but the jihad remains.
Okay.
If Israel were to cease to exist tomorrow, they would wage jihad against Spain and find provocation to do
Right.
so. If the United States were to withdraw all its troops from the whole world tomorrow,
Right.
they would find some other offense somehow
Okay.
and continue to wage jihad, because jihad is a responsibility for Muslims. And so it's not something that is going to end. And ultimately, there are many attempts to restore the caliphate.
Right.
Even Mullah Omar was named the caliph in Afghanistan in
Right.
1996.
Right.
And not many people recognize him as such. But if someone were to grow more powerful than he is, then it's possible he could attract that kind of following and then declare an offensive jihad.
Right.
I have a question about what is good about Islam. I understand it's very seductive, and even FBI agents are seduced by it. But if you take away Sharia law and Muhammad out of the Quran, what is left that is good?
You can't take Muhammad and Sharia out of Islam. That would be like taking the Pope and Holy Communion out of Catholicism. You can't take the Torah out of Judaism. It's the same thing. And Islam is what Muhammad said and did, and what the Quran says. That's what it's all based on. Now, what's good in it? There's a kind of a folk religion that's not, strictly speaking, Islam by the book, that prevails in many parts of the world, or has prevailed up until the Saudis have bankrolled its destruction and its replacement by the more virulent and violent form that they favor. But, for example, if you were to go in the 1970s or the 1960s to Mogadishu, which is a hellhole now, but if you were to go there, you would find people who were Muslims who would be very kind to you. And they would tell you that they were being kind to you because of Islam. And I've met Muslims who actually think, particularly Somalis, but also from all over the world, and they're not very educated in Islam itself. And they seem to think that being nice, being kind, being charitable to other people is a specifically Islamic concept.
And so they think that they have this kind of a vague folk religion that is Islamic in character, but which makes them behave better than they might have otherwise. No, that's a fact. But the problem is that when they start actually reading the book is so full of hate and so full of exhortations to violence that the more devout and knowledgeable they get in the religion, the worse people they're likely to be. And this is the problem that we have to confront. It does no good to sugarcoat it.
We're going to have to
Right
make
here.
this the last question.
One more.
Yes. I just, in retrospect, I think that we must understand and forgive ex-President Carter, because in the welcoming of Khomeini, he was a little mixed up, and he thought it was the second coming of Christ. Anyway, my question is this. We have police departments begging the Muslim communities, please let us know if you see unusual activity so we can, not have another massacre. And yet the response has been very, very little, hardly at all. So I'm wondering, are they afraid of the repulsion of the people around them, the Muslims, or is there something in the Quran that says you don't snitch on other Muslims or anything negative about them?
Yes. Chapter 4, verse 92 of the Quran says, don't kill other Muslims. And by extension, in Islamic theology, you really are not to act in any negative way against other Muslims. There is a very strong dichotomy in Islam between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. That really characterizes all of Islam. It's all about that dichotomy. Chapter 48, verse 29 of the Quran says, Muhammad is the apostle of Allah. Those who follow him are merciful to one another, but ruthless to the unbelievers. And so if the unbelievers are saying, if you see something, say something. Please help us. The believers are going to say, no, I can't, I won't, because they are Muslims and you're not. They're not going to say that to their faces, but that's how they will act. And so you have Trump again. Recently, he in his big foreign policy speech that he gave right after the Orlando shooting, he said that the Muslim communities have to help us with this, implying that they weren't, which was absolutely true. And Ibrahim Hooper of the Council on American Islamic Relations was on television the next night denouncing Trump and saying, of course, what does he mean? We always give help to law enforcement. Now, this guy is the spokesman for an organization that hands out pamphlets at its conferences that say, don't talk to the FBI. And one of them is what to do when the FBI knocks on your door with a picture of somebody going, shh. And I have photographs of these pamphlets that were taken by friends in the CARE conferences. And then he goes on television and says they always cooperate. They tell people not to cooperate with law enforcement. And as a matter of fact, it's very rare that you find Muslims actually revealing a terror plot before it happens. After it happens, they'll all say, oh yes, if it's undeniable that they knew the man, then they say, well, I tried to talk him out of it or something like that, but they never called the cops. And of course, the reason for that is the primary loyalty is to the Muslims. And also because of all the violence and hatred in the Quran, even if somebody is never going to blow himself up or shoot people himself, he's not necessarily against other people doing it. Thank you very much.